urban planning. So with that, I wanted to introduce everybody to Joshua Claxton. Joshua is a dual degree master's student in comparative urban planning and international governance at UCLA. He originates from West Africa, was raised in New Jersey and spent some of his most formative time in Jordan. His research is guided by the Black radical tradition and focuses on urban violence, democracy, and African diasporic experiences in the US and Europe. I also wanted to introduce our students, not one by one, but there's a few roles that you may have noticed we're playing here. We have sort of the development team, making sure that the recording is going well, the AV is taken care of, and then we have our sort of editorial team. They're taking notes on basically some of the things that will come up, and we will use this materials to sort of analyze, what was in this panel. So with that, welcome, Joshua. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to start sort of allowing you to give a brief overview of how you say your work is about and what are your interests are.
Sure. To start, I think it would be good to define urban planning, assuming most of you are not also in my master's program, because I've never seen any of you before. So a good way to think about planning is how space is designed and the subsequent social phenomena that come out of that space. That could be human community space, but it could also be non. So within the planning discipline, we talk a lot about the interactions between human communities and non-human communities, whether it's displacement of natural environments as well as human environments. UCLA's program is particularly focused on challenges of creating equitable and harmonious communities and sort of winners and losers of those spaces. So thinking about phenomena like gentrification, like colonialism, and who has access to the train, those sorts of things. I got to planning, I think it's important to lay this out. So I got to planning partially through my own identity. So coming from African ancestry, my people did not choose to come to this country. And so African diasporic people in America always have a very complicated relationship to land and lose control of that land. And so that's something that's kind of always been, I was kind of always a little social justice warrior in high school, et cetera. And as I learned more about ways to study space, it was actually who controls the policies in those spaces. I felt like it was a good little place to kind of find an intellectual and professional home for myself. Also, as Sergio mentioned, I used to live in Jordan, which is a whole other story that I will not get into because it's not related to this talk. But living out there, I had a lot of exposure to Jordan is a majority Palestinian country at this point. And hearing stories from my Palestinian friends and understanding how their community ended up in Jordan through the construction of Israel and the power struggle over the land that is Palestine and Israel now also had a pretty permanent impact on it. I think a lot about what it means to call a place home and what it means to then lose that home. Okay, now my work. So I'm a master's student, first year, have not started my thesis, but I'm thinking a lot about what I want to do on. I'm particularly interested in, back to my identity, how my family got here. A lot of Black families got to the US, and how, frankly, it's not really working out very well. I think we're all familiar with that in terms of the history of Black rebellion, the history of state and private violence against Black communities. So I'm particularly interested in, okay, you have these hyper multicultural spaces in the US with a group of people who, a variety of people, but in my particular case, Black communities that feel wholly disenfranchised and are exposed to disproportionate violence. And how do we rectify that? So I kind of call it the integration problem. So we had Brown Board of Education in 1954. And I was kind of supposed to say, okay, we've resolved and rectified this history of segregation and lack of access to resources, particularly in key cities. A lot of Blacks were concentrated after the Great Migration. But that's not really played out. We still, I mean, in LA alone, we see drastic segregation. So my research and thesis idea is kind of how do we rectify that? What are the grassroots as well as institutional structures that need to be propped up, or the tools that can be used to bring about both obviously less violence from the police and also gang violence within Black communities, and then also what are the ways that a group of people can feel fully seen, represented in governance, safe, and like they have the right to be in space, in a city, in a neighborhood.
So yeah, thanks for starting with that. I think I wanted to zero in on one of the aspects that you just mentioned. And maybe preface by saying that I think most of us come to urban environments or cities like LA, assuming a structure that is, we surely maybe understand that it's been constructed, and we don't understand the level to which it's been designed to be this way. So, for the power of imagination or frameworks, I wanted to ask you what examples of, the idea of land, right, as property, which is a very Western framework. Do you have any other examples of what land means for, say, Native Americans, African communities, Afro-American communities? Now, what are other ways to relate to land?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's also funny you bring that up, Sergio, because a lot of my coursework, as I mentioned before, a lot of UCLA's program is focused on who has access to what. And so a lot of my coursework is about property, and yeah, you got it. The sort of the unit of measure in urban planning frameworks is property, and the ways that sort of instantiates power through capital, through safety, protection.
Even protection of capital good or property.
Yes. Yeah. But then also, I mean, if you think about who law enforcement sort of strives to protect as property people, as property owners, property represents citizenship in many ways, the right to vote, historically. So yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that, and I'm not an anthropologist or a historian, but I think it's generally considered that indigenous communities in the Americas and elsewhere had a much more personal and harmonious relationship to the place that they lived. It was not tied to some sort of arbitrary value as we relate to property now. It was home and property. Well, I don't think property existed. I think it's a very modern construction. And home was, yeah, it was a place where people foraged, they hunted, they had traditions that they practiced. As humans, we are also a very nomadic species prior to the creation of property. And ultimately, I think property does to us that what we see a lot of kind of constructs do, which is it creates this binary of those who have and those who don't. And so the unproperty communities of people then take on this kind of political meaning, which is very dire. I think we're confronted that in many ways, whether that's the homelessness crisis in LA, or whether that's the history of people being able to participate in civics, be able to vote based on property. One other thing I want to say on property is, so the history of planning is, again, I'm assuming you all know this history. So urban planning wasn't really a career or it did not exist as an agency until about the beginning of the Second Industrial Revolution, kind of 1880s in England and in France. That's kind of where it comes from. it was very much a response to what I would call is a crisis of property. So you had the Industrial Revolution brought all these people into these European cities, particularly France and England. And it was mostly kind of day laborers who were more or less impoverished. And the powers that be at the time didn't know what to do with all these poor people in the city. And so it was kind of addressing this notion of pathology of poverty and containing people who were doing these jobs in the factories who were poor, but not really knowing, because prior to that it was kind of this public health crisis where folks who kind of ran London or Paris didn't really, it was unseen, they didn't like how it looked, it was dangerous, it was allegedly disease ridden to have all these people in these really dense areas, kind of quote unquote slums. And so it's very much a response to not knowing how to deal with the inherent outcome of capitalism, which is there will be people who have and those who don't. And so that's kind of the origins of it, and not knowing what to do with space and property and people who don't have resources.
Yeah, just so that it doesn't fall through the cracks, because I think that there's a lot of richness in there. Could you say more about what you mean by apologizing poverty?
Yes, so I will try. So I think that what I mean by that is there are systems and patterns that lead to someone, say, not having a home or having to live on the street. Or in the 1880s, someone living in a super dense slum in Paris with like 5 other families. And those conditions were the factory owner or whatever, the property owner, sort of accruing the majority of the resources and wealth that came out of that production. And most of the people doing that labor not getting those resources and then not having the ability to access a home or build wealth. And so I think pathologize, by that I mean sort of saying that thing, that phenomenon in and of itself is the problem and sort of reinforces itself. And so in blunt terms, poor people are poor because they're poor. I say it's kind of pathologized. It's something endemic within those people that leads them into this cycle of being poor.
And it feels like we keep feeding rhetorics, right, of that narrative, right?
Yes.
I think, maybe I want to ask for your opinion, because I think this, maybe at a more abstract level, calls for I would make the argument by asking you, genuine, calls for a linkage between sovereignty over the land with personhood. Right? There's different levels of personhood and a hierarchy of it that seems to be associated to the level of sovereignty of the land, whether it's in the form of property or some other sort of political economic power. How does that? Is that something that you agree with, or is mapped somehow onto current urban planning? Is accounted for and
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'm trying to see whether there is any mapping, any linkage between sovereignty of the land in the form that we understand it today, with its property, even if it's publicly owned, right? Who has sovereignty and authority over the usage of our land? And by personhood, I mean, who is deemed more or less human, and that it means by either rights or dignity or basic needs. Right?
Yeah, for sure. I think I'm in a class right now where we're trying to do some of this big mapping in geographic information system software around actually how gentrification and property middle class folks moving into a neighborhood becomes co-constitutive of a rise and arrest of that neighborhood. And so I think that, identifying that personhood, or another word for that I like would be citizenship, is based on or sort of supported by one's access to property and the state sort of determines who that is and when they show up. In the case of middle class folks moving to a neighborhood that historically looked different, felt different, was culturally different, had different economics, and all of a sudden there are more 311 calls on the people who live in that neighborhood, which are like low level police calls, nuisance calls, loitering. We're not talking about violent crime. And so yeah, I think that relationship between who's deemed a citizen, who gets that representation, who gets protected by the state is inextricable from who gets protected by the sovereign is inextricable from property.
Yeah, and it kind of links back to what you were saying earlier, right? Which is, so the state's surveillance or protection of safety of property, really, at the end of the day, when the people don't drive that. This kind of opens, I do want to tap into technology, right? A little bit. So this,
Can I say?
yeah, of course, of course.
Yeah, so I mean, property's like, you got me started. I mean, property is a big part of brand, especially in UCLA. We also talk a lot about how property is not just, it's not just a physical piece of land or a building that one owns or one has access to, but it's also this kind of psychological expectation of a way of relating to everybody else and to the sovereign. And it kind of has this iterative effect where property kind of guarantees that you expect an outcome in a situation. So there's this really famous piece, this law journal piece by Cheryl Harris, who's a law professor at UCLA, called Whiteness as Property. And she kind of lays that out where it is this relationship where the beginning of the construction of the US project, you had enslaved African folks and you had sort of white enslavers, but you also had white indentured servants. And there was this threat to the enslavers that, well, if the enslaved African folks and white indentured servants start to organize, obviously I'm in the union, pretty much organized. They start to organize, that's a threat to the power structure and the wealth that's generated from these plantations. And so what once was just, property was once based on class, and then very quickly the sort of the power structure in the US realized, okay, well, we need to, in order to maintain this enormous capital project, we need to flip that and make property about race, not class. And I think we still see that playing out today. And it's very much, I think, based on expectations of how, if I own a home and I have kids with my partner, they're going to get to go to a good school because we have invested in this community in that way. And another important point about property in the US is that the largest government subsidy in the country is mortgage deduction interest. And those who don't know, that's pretty much you get a tax write-off if you own a home. That's like not talked about at all. But certain parts of the political spectrum will focus on welfare and other government spending and not acknowledge that wealthy people, the privileged class, is actually getting a huge government subsidy every year.
Yeah, I've been picking a lot of fights as just as a tenant in LA, from a privilege class and economic status. In my own way, that's I want to go back to all these topics, but it's not like I want to move to technology. I want to bring technology in, right? Because at the end of the day, okay, modern urban planning, I have no idea what I'm talking about, but I'm sure there's GIS mapping, some like new fancy technologies to delineate, put clear lines and boundaries. And there's methods, probably policies that have mentioned this. So can you speak to what are some of the technologies? Just open little tutorial. What are some of the key technologies that are used to delineate property?
With my opinion of them or
All of them.
fact.
Fact and
The
opinion.
full bag.
I'm not sure where the line between those two is.
Yeah, okay, so there is, I don't know how to know this, okay, there's GIS, which is. It's actually, that's not a software, that is a way of thinking. I would actually say the GIS is almost like saying. Or it's a system of thinking, it's not actually a platform. So that's geographic information systems. It is simply put a way to take something like census data and take something like, or okay, totally different example. It's a really good way to take images of the mountain range and population patterns of a particular species, and over time how that's changing based on, I don't know, greenhouse gases, or based on rural gentrification, development is pushing out species, and visualizing that on a map. That data can then be put into things like Adobe Creative Suite, Adobe Illustrator, Photoshop, make that pretty.
What do you think? What do you say that is? What do you say, a form of thinking as opposed to
System of
a system of thinking? Why do you say that?
Because it's, well, practically speaking, there are a lot of softwares within GIS. The sort of undertone perhaps is that, yeah, I think it's a particular way of viewing the world. I mean, something in the mapping, this is more geography than I'm playing out, but in the mapping world, there's something called counter mapping, which is about looking at existing maps or existing ways of understanding space and kind of reframing it and reclaiming it to be something else. So the best example I can think of is, we're right now all on borrowed land, on the and Chumash people. And so a counter mapping project would be mapping, the UCLA campus based on indigenous territory. But that would never work in ArcGIS, which is one of the softwares, or in R coding language, where you can also map, or Python, because there's not the ways that those communities related to their land just wouldn't fit into that system of thinking. Because these softwares are very much, you need defined boundaries. We need discrete data that speaks to a very specific resource or service or outcome. Which honestly, full circle, and something that some notes I jotted down before this. Generally, I think when we talk about planning or when we talk about colonial logics applied to planning or the cosmos, humans have found themselves at a place where we look at everything through a binary crystal, and we don't. I think something that historically human species were better at is understanding concepts and existence as a continuum, and as kind of an ongoing journey. Which also that's probably very good right now. I'll get to what that more ask thoughts on that, but yeah, I think in terms of understanding what home is, I think we've now. And back to property, like I think humans have got to a place where we're very limited. I think what existence or prosperity looks like. It's very finite.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of people find themselves perhaps in I don't know a lot of people, but I've heard it from anecdotal conversations with myself too. This adherence of home to property in the house, right, and finding sometimes a lot of comfort in that, but also sometimes isolation and maybe not know it, right? The idea that you are sort of encapsulating something as broad and rich as the concept of home, right, into a structure that is the three-dimensional, right? With a number of bathrooms and bedrooms, it seems not only reductionist, but a little bit less. Right?
For sure. And to build upon that, it's private. It's just for you and maybe your partner, and maybe your kids, and whatever animals you have in the house. But back to something brought up earlier, Sergio, like we, as a species, we didn't always think that way. There are much more communal ways to live that, to your point, I think are really beautiful and not depressing.
Yeah, we wanted to open the flow for conversation too. Please ask any questions. And yeah, introduce yourselves by name. Interests.
So like, kind of like what you said about the GSI mapping system, which like wouldn't even work for different ways of viewing land, and I'm assuming that like there's kind of like ideas even within urban planning that like are kind of built on something that maybe isn't even necessarily correct, and how do you like move forward if the systems are like already kind of messed up, sort of, if that makes sense.
Also, just for your guys, GIS.
Oh, yeah. I have it right in.
Oh, right. How do we shake it up based on the existing structure? For one, I think doing things like this, where I mean, I was telling my friends that about this a little bit. Like, what? They're like, what are you doing? So I think to some extent, chat like leaning into that unknown generally. I mean, I think this project of bringing in social science theory, queer theory, Black radical tradition theory into political sciences is sort of a similar task. You have this really rigid system. It's usually controlled by certain people who kind of all look very similar. And like, how do you shake that up? I think some of it is courage and being laughed at too. I was laughed at today by some of my friends because they were like, "Why are you doing this thing?" But then more seriously, I think it's okay. So I jotted down some notes before this. If we do get into the sci-fi realm of the conversation,
Please, yeah.
And something that Octavia Butler does a good job of, and then another really great nonfiction writer, Adrienne Marie Brown, who wrote a lot of her work based on Octavia Butler's fiction and sci-fi fiction, is that yeah, we have to be the change points. We can't expect it to come from this system, so to speak. So the changes in our interactions, the changes in the conversations about with your friends over lunch or whatever, how you think when you're alone, that ultimately has ramifications and does reverberate outward. And so it does kind of start, the internal work starts, and then that is, we kind of push that beyond the boundaries of ourselves into the discourse. To make that clear, I think it's challenge yourself first, and recognize that we are, whatever, I don't know, whether it's rigidity of physics and maybe embracing other soft science ideas, whether it's capitalism or whatever, challenging ourselves in ways that we internalize and been indoctrinated that we don't even, if we don't really sit with it, we don't realize because it's so embedded. And the same is true for racism. I mean, growing up in the US, like, assuming most of us are racist, that's probably not a fair assumption. Growing up in the world, all of us are racist. Like, that's just how the world works. And it's about, looking internally and saying, okay, well, where can I be better? And then pushing that out, which I think is like part of that feeling. But then we also have to get in the streets and yell at the state and demand better of our society at the same time.
Yes.
I'm Johanna. I'm pre-med, so this is like, I know nothing about it. But I guess my question was like, those of us who this is not like a thing that we're going to be putting a lot of like our life into in that way. Like, what does it look like to start helping the issue on a consumer level?
is it just education? Is it like a specific way of treating the way you buy property, your own property? Just get
Can you specify the issue that you're referring to?
Oh, I know when we originally were talking about this specific property, we were talking about, just the discrepancies and how, specifically like the US, use land and how segregated it still is. Like, what does that look like on the consumer level of trying to not make the problem worse?
Like, don't gentrify, kind of
Oh,
thing?
yeah.
You did not. What can we as individuals? I think that. Yeah, I mean, try to migrate. Responsibly. Do some due diligence, do some homework, do some research on where we move. I mean, I think it is a really good question, and it's really hard to answer, especially in spaces like this where we're all, one of my professors in planning as well, where he's like, coming to UCLA, you've now entered a distinct class of society. And it's unfair that you're here and somebody else is in here. And this being here is going to then confer this power to us in the world, and probably to some degree well. So we do have a responsibility to take that power we've unfairly gained by being there and do the right thing. Yeah, I'm gonna be honest, I don't really have, that's like, that is a big question within the planning space, is how do we stop things like gentrification? How do we get individuals to raise property differently? And also some of that, to be honest, does have to happen on a policy level. There's simply not enough affordable housing built in the US. It's only due to laws and due to financial incentives, it's only built in the same neighborhoods that then get overleased and have, because there aren't wealthy property owners in those neighborhoods, they don't have great schools for their children. So yeah, let me always sit with that one. I might have some ideas later in the conversation, but it's a good question. There's not a clear answer.
I wanted to sort of add on to what was said, because I think I want to zero in on what you said about the responsibility that comes with power and privilege. Sometimes you attain privilege or are born into privilege without any power. So in addition to that, I think it's important to recognize this perhaps might be a philosophical question, but the way I see these types of issues is that they are easy to say, it's a system level issue, but in reality, systemic issues cannot be solved at an individual level. They can be perhaps supported, ameliorated, you can vote, you can make more conscious decisions. But if you make way too much money and want to buy property, letting go of your money, giving it away or not buying property is not going to make a difference. You might take a big sacrifice. And it's still the system will continue as is, right? So there needs to be collective action and policy, and also a direct acknowledgement that much of what we see in discrepancies and inequity are by design. This is what we were talking earlier about, for example, the US project, right? It's intentional, how it was established, and now it's still intrinsic. So we need to, I think, as a collective, be really honest about why we are what we are. And I think the reality is transcend personal responsibility. And I think that's my take on it.
Yeah, I do think it's a bit of a dialogue in terms of our. I don't think you and I disagree, but I think there is. Yeah, I think the individual does have some. Yeah, I do agree. And not just in voting, I think, to go back to another one of my professors always says, we go to fiction. It's like a go to fiction. I think to go back to some of Octavia Butler's work in the Parable series. So for those who haven't read it, the main character, Lauren Alameda, finds herself in California, it's 2030, 2040. There's environmental catastrophe and collapse. There's totalitarian dictatorship going on.
Well on their way.
We're not far off. And Octavia was, I mean, she was very appreciative. Serious way. But I bring it up to say that Lauren, the protagonist, she's existing in a society where there's a terrible relationship to the natural environment. Big industries extract everything, and there's systemic collapse of the environment and ecology. And there's also this very misogynistic dictator in power. And circumstances necessitate that she and her people essentially flee. I mean, it's full chaos for this one. So they flee and they go start their own community, in which they create everything that's the exact opposite of that. So they grow their own food on land. There is within their society, there's unprecedented power. The women in the community, they sort of do away with gender as well. Their commune that they create. I bring that up to say, us creating our own new society is only going to happen if there's systemic collapse, which hopefully doesn't happen. That's going to be very bad. So a lot of people, but I do think there's small ways that we can challenge this system and yeah, I think it's a duality. There's small ways we can challenge it, as well as demand more policy and the institution.
I'm Daniel. I'm a pre-sociology major. And earlier on, you mentioned like you like kind of briefly touched on the like conflict with Israel-Palestine. So in like senior year of high school, I studied abroad over there for like 4 months. And going into that, I didn't really, well, I kind of had an opinion, but it was like very fostered and like the trip was very catered. And then coming home, things started shifting, and I talked to my brother, and I tried to like do my own learning while I was there. But I'm curious with urban planning, a lot of the education around it is looking at maps and how the maps of the land has changed as the occupation changed and mandates and like, I don't know, it's a lot of history, but I'm curious if with your experience in urban planning, if there's a way to look at that has like an optimal outcome. I know there's talks of like 2-state solution, there's still like single state solution, and as the maps change and Palestinians are further and further marginalized, is there a way to come back from that? That is, I know it's very loaded, but I'm curious.
Also a great question. Guys, I'm not that smart. Yeah, I mean, so personally, you're specifically talking about the Palestinian issue.
Yeah.
Personally, I think that it's either going to be this bear with me. Either Israel will take over everything that was once Palestine, which, for those who don't know, was once Palestine was a harmonious space in which Jewish people, both Sephardic Jewish people, Arab Jewish people, as well as Arab Muslims and Arab Christians, all lived in peace under the Ottoman Empire. Then Israel was created, etc. But I think that either that's going to happen, and Israel will take over everything in Palestine, and all Palestinians will either sort of assimilate into the Israeli state, and honestly go through a very similar struggle to a lot of minorities here, demanding access to voting, property, and resources. Folks in Gaza will continue to demand more, because that's essentially an open air prison. Or by some grace of the gods, there will be a single state where they will return to what that land looked like under the Ottoman Empire, in which a bunch of multicultural, there's only one space where a bunch of people existed peacefully. Yeah, I don't think a 2-state situation is likely. There's, in undergrad, I wrote a piece on this, my school's paper. Both sides have extremist forces and powers that I think would prohibit the two-state solution. I think the extreme demands from both communities are way too vigorous for two states that would work. On that note, it's a good point. Talk about planning and maps, you know, it's essential to say that particularly outside like Western Europe, where states were constructed based on wars between England and France and Portugal and Spain or whatever. Pretty much outside Western Europe, a lot of boundaries that we know today were drawn in a room that looked probably like this, by mostly white men. And that is also something we're up against often in planning when we talk about planning globally, is almost every country in the continent of Africa country today was drawn in a room by students, or whatever, equivalent. And so some conflict we see today, or perceptions of certain states and communities, violence, famines, I mean, so much of that is tied to, well, then all these groups of people were forced into this state that didn't exist 100 years ago. And it's also that recent. I mean, that's something a lot of our professors in the planning department are historians, and it makes sense because, I mean, so much of what we're dealing with now, particularly as it relates to space and policy, these are recent phenomena. I mean, again, as I said earlier, planning and it's the reason for its construction to sort of contain the core happened, less than 200 years ago. So we're still kind of figuring it out. Back to some of the questions, we're still figuring out how to make human communities in a dense space that are harmonious and are equitable. Because for most of human existence, that did not exist.
So does that make civilization sort of like metropoly a beacon for hope or the demise?
I mean, I'm hopeful. I think it's a cool endeavor. I like making maps, but it's definitely difficult. It's definitely very, very difficult. There's there are a lot of inputs, and I would say that with the creation of cities, we've made a lot of our own problems that again, I think weren't as we're just prevalent. Even just talking about poverty, like global inequality that we see today is, so we've sort of reached this point in human development in the Anthropocene where we've never had so much wealth on real terms, accounting for purchasing power, etc. We've never had so much productivity. We've never had so much innovation, but we've also never had this much inequality, both interregionally. So if you look at LA compared to some rural part of California, as well as if you compare California to some, community where I used to live in Jordan, and I think that's a big part of what we are trying to fix with cities. And if you can't tell, I'm pretty lukewarm on capitalism. But yeah, I think we'll talk about cities as well. Capitalism part of it.
Hi, I'm Aditi. I also have no background in urban planning. I'm a molecular bio major. So a lot of the stuff that I do, I'm planning on going into like biomedical research. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how like urban planning in particular has affected like, say, people's like access or the way we think about like medicine, and like if there's anything that people that are going into med or like anything related to that, anything that we should keep in mind when we're doing our job.
Okay, quick plug. If you all are able to, I recommend you take a planning course, by the way. There's some really great professors who I'm happy to give the names of after this little chat. Yeah, I mean, so as I mentioned before, a lot of the history of planning comes from actually notions of public health and notions of sanitation and cities and trying to, yeah, and seeing communities as sort of disease driven, and pathologizing communities. So I think that keeping a perspective and framework on where healthcare is and who has access to it. I think, yeah, I mean, keeping in mind that the same logics have persisted, and these policies that obtain that sort of originated in a lot of problems we're dealing with still exist, but sort of under the mud. And yeah, I mean, so much in the city is mission correlated. So I've been talking about property, but the same places where there aren't as many single family homes, there's also less access to the healthcare. And so yeah, I think building that in, and then to tie it, like building that into how you think about the world whenever you come up against those spatial inequalities, which will come up, by the way. Because I do think it kind of underpins everything. And then also, to tie into COVID and vaccines. Yeah, I think personally understanding why, yeah, I mean, Christ, this is not an anti-vax plug. This is not an anti-vax plug. But yeah, there's certain communities that don't trust the medical space. Particularly Black community, and that's people should still get vaccinated, but the logic behind not trusting the vaccinations, particularly in cities, it makes sense because there's such a history of the healthcare industry using people, using their bodies for advancements, for science.
So we tapped into this in the first panel session. A little
Oh,
bit,
cool. Yeah, well, yeah, important.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, just some important moments in history, things like the study of syphilis was done on Black men who didn't know they were being tested and then died. Even though the scientists, I don't know if there's a corporation or a state, but the scientists had the inoculation and they didn't get it since then. For a lot of gynecology was learned and done on involuntarily on Black women. So I think, knowing that history and knowing that it's that legacy's persisted, and yeah, people are, particularly with science and medicine, people are distrusting us still because that relationship's not been, that fracture's not been remedied.
Hi, I'm Audrey. I'm in a class about America in the 1960s, and we recently talked about redlining and looked at the specific surveys that urban planners would use to go into communities and take note of the racial and ethnic makeup of them, and also the architectural styles and stuff, and then use that for redlining. And I feel like that just really contrasts with the vision of urban planning we're getting from this seminar. So how do you think urban planning as a field has developed from that very racist and upholding racist structures to now and the way that, I mean, I don't know if it's the whole field or just you, but how it is now.
No, I mean, so no, you're right. There has been a dramatic shift. I don't know when it happened, to be honest. I mean, I'm a first year. I was looking at urban planning programs for a couple of years before this. Every program in the US talks about everything we've been talking about here. They're really on it when it comes to talking about inequality and oppression, and things like reparations and redistribution. My hunch is that it was the filtering in of other disciplines and specialists that we're kind of already doing that work and analysis. So, yeah, as you said, I mean, planning used to be a much more, I want to say, sort of, like very structured discipline that was tied to real estate and very strictly about how to make a space pretty. Folks like the person who designed the second part of Frederick Law Homestead. I mean, he was an urban planner, and his job was to make Central Park nice. What the history books don't talk about, though, is in that process they kicked out a self-determining Black community called the Second Village that through eminent domain. But yeah, I mean, I think it's that like in disciplines like geography, history, sociology. Honestly, a lot of our professors at UCLA are from those disciplines. So I think it's mostly that those disciplines starting to sort of share their thinking about the world. And yeah, the history doesn't really doesn't lie. So I think it's that part. And a plug for UCLA's program. A lot of the programs in the US don't, they say this stuff, but they don't really do it. The courses aren't really about these topics. So UCLA definitely check us out.
I think for me, the question that rises to me is, and I'm not making an educated comment here, but I still see these practices continuing to replicate themselves. So I think the question comes to, is there a disconnect between academic thinking and, acknowledgement of racism in urban planning, for example, its history or its current action, and but who actually implements the policy or approves the plans, right, at the city level, at the county level. Because I feel like these issues continue to come up around the country, in spite of, for example, an infusion of these ideas coming into the classroom. Perhaps you could argue in favor or against the fact that some of these notions happen.
Oh, I see. Sort of why is the disconnect between what's maybe discussed in the academy and what's being done on the policy level? Time. Yeah, time. I mean, I think it's honestly, I think this change in planning is like a decade, maybe. Because I've spoken to people who've done planning before. And this is definitely very recent. Yeah. Probably, kind of like Barack Obama, to be honest. No, but seriously, I think that's when, speaking critically about systems, and who has access to what kind of, I think it's good. But talking about it is not enough. And so a lot of your questions, how do we take action? Hopefully we can all come up with that together.
We need to get them graduated first.
No, it starts now. It starts now. I'm recruiting, you can't tell.
You have time for maybe another question? Yes.
Hi, I'm MJ. I'm a environment major, and I was wondering, in my Spanish class in high school, we talked a lot about like globalization, and we looked at how in some communities it's been like a really important vital tool in spreading education, information, and like even electronics and access to like newer ideas and like advanced healthcare and whatnot. But in other like cases, it's almost like it would be described as like almost like global gentrification. Like you're taking away like what makes these communities inherently like special and unique and in a lot of ways better than what we consider as the Western norm. So I guess that what I'm asking is like, what are your thoughts on globalization? I'm not saying you have to be like pro or against, but like just in general, please have anything.
I'm certainly against it. For the reasons you described, I think as I was saying before, we're at this place where in the Anthropocene where we have unprecedented innovation and technology and aggregate wealth, but it's also more concentrated than it's ever been before. And the disparity is far greater than it's ever been. And yeah, to your point, I mean, we have this person. We came to the US from South Africa. We made a car called the Tesla. And that's kind of part of globalization. That's super cool because we have an electric car that is more or less, I guess, accessible to maybe middle class family. It's not the most expensive car in the market. But those batteries that power that car are fundamentally tied to extractive mining in places like Zimbabwe and rural China. That is destroying those communities, ruining those people's lives. We don't even know what the potential public health still on Earth that's going to be. So I think that feels like an example to me of the paradox of globalization, and how it has created these really intense employment changes. But I also acknowledge it as a debate, and a lot of professors on North Campus would argue the benefits of that the lawsuits, because you're right. I mean, on the whole, there are some public health measures that have yeah, on the whole, I think babies are more likely to that I honestly I'm not it's something I do go for. I'm actually in a class right now, living in planning school, about why wealth, jobs, and skilled labor concentrated in cities. And how what we do about that. Do we encourage everyone to move to cities, or do we try to revitalize the kind of loss towns in the West and in the US spaces?
I think I like the example that you gave, because I think I'm trying to tie it back to the conversation that we started earlier on, a little more abstract, like the idea of property, country, state boundaries, right? And yet globalization in a way challenges that we want to acknowledge it, right? What is this all going to let a community affected, by mining, for example, by powers that are far away from what they call their sovereign state. Right? So it's just this the same paradox, right? We want to say that these countries or these communities that may have sovereignty yet, they are indeed what kind of sovereignty?
Yeah, that's a super important point. And it's a threat to democracy. I mean, yeah, to your point, Sergio, I think globalization also pushes us up against what it means to exist in a polity that's representative. Because we're now in a place where government policy can be so warped and informed by capital, which might be coming from somewhere else in the world, and so then it becomes this really intense disillusionment. Like how do I get change to happen when I don't know, and I might not even speak the same language as the person who actually has the most control over my community because they have so much capital, and maybe they own a lot of real estate property, or they own the big business and employs everybody. So yeah, I think there's this intense question of governance that comes with globalization. And to be a little bit more optimistic and sanguine, like I think there is something really cool about globalization. I mean, all of us are in here in globalization, and we obviously represent a lot of identities. That could be really powerful. And on the whole, I think multiculturalism is awesome. It's come at this expense of it's come at the expense of like individual and community sovereignty. I think if we as a species can get to a place where we have these awesome exchanges in multicultural space, but then people still have autonomy over themselves, over their communities, over their culture, and it's not washed out by now I'm just preaching, but so it's not washed out by capital. I mean, we now exist in a society where the culture is like, people say it's like American culture is permeating, but it's really capitalism is permeating. That's what washes out that autonomy. Not speaking of it, so. I feel good, but it will be a struggle. It's not gonna be easy.
Maybe another 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, time is,
I would sound that.
it's of the essence, I'm sure.
Are there any, maybe one last quick question of President?
Ask a question. I'm curious what compelled all of you to take this course? And how does that inform how you were thinking about the world, or how, and I guess how you made a challenge in the world?
Yeah, I'm Joseph. I'm currently undergrad, but I'm taking for environmental science. Honestly, I came to UCLA because of like how much change actually happened at the school, and we all see the problems that happen in the world every day, and it's just like the big thing with like environmental sciences and obviously global warming and everything. Yeah, so we all see that nothing's getting done, and so I want to take classes that taught me different perspectives to see like which way or which combination of ways of thinking I could select and say this makes sense to me, and this is how we should go about fixing the problems. And so this class I saw as like merging a lot of those and getting, honestly, I really like the speakers coming and telling us like their perspectives and like it's way better than getting like preached at one person, especially like a curriculum that's all laid out that everyone's teaching. So, yeah.